All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We always love getting feedback from you guys, and we've been getting a lot of requests to do a deep dive on a single book of the Bible, and we thought we'd tackle one that's really captivating, really powerful, and yeah, so we're going to be jumping into the Book of Ruth
Yeah, the Book of Ruth,
from the KJV.
specifically the King James Version. And yeah, I think this is going to be a fun one. It's a really fascinating story. It's nestled in the Old Testament during the time of the Judges, which, if you recall from some of our past deep dives, was a very difficult time for the Israelites. It was a time of what's been described as like religious and moral degeneracy, national disunity, and frequent foreign oppression.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like today, but
Yeah.
in the midst of all that, the Book of Ruth kind of offers this contrasting glimpse of peace and quiet faithfulness.
Yeah, it really does.
And this book is significant for a few reasons. First of all, it's one of only two books in the Bible named after a woman, right?
Yeah, that's right. The other one being Esther.
Esther. And it also plays a vital role in tracing the lineage of King David.
That's right.
And ultimately to Jesus. You see that in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 and 5, and also alluded to in Ruth chapter 4, verses 21 and 22. So at its core, the Book of Ruth is an exploration of faithful love and redemption.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a story about loyalty. It's a story about God's providence. It's a story about redemption. All these amazing themes that are really relevant for us today. And, it's interesting. We don't actually know for sure who wrote the book. Jewish tradition often attributes it to Samuel. But the text itself, when you look at it closely, it seems to suggest that it might have been written later, maybe during the time of the monarchy,
Okay.
because of the mention of David and the literary style.
Interesting.
But regardless of who wrote it, our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the narrative, chapter by chapter, and to understand those key events, the characters, and the big ideas that are woven throughout this relatively short book.
Yeah, it's amazing how much is packed into this short book.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So let's jump in. Chapter 1. We can kind of title this chapter, Naomi Emptied and Returns.
Okay, I like that.
The first 5 verses, they set the stage. We're in the time of the Judges, and a famine has struck the land of Judah. This forces Elimelech, along with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to leave Bethlehem and seek refuge in the land of Moab.
Yeah. And Moab was just east of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. So not too far, but still, a different land, a different culture. And so they go there hoping to escape the famine, but unfortunately, that's not the end of their troubles.
Yeah.
Tragedy strikes when Elimelech dies, and Naomi is left a widow in a foreign land. And to make matters worse, her 2 sons, who had married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, they also pass away,
Wow.
leaving all 3 women widows. It's
Yeah.
a really powerful image of loss and vulnerability.
So verses 6 through 18 describe Naomi deciding to return to Bethlehem. She's heard that the famine's over. So she sets out to go back to her homeland, and she encourages her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to stay in Moab. She tells them, go back to your mother's houses, find new husbands, start new lives. And she even offers them a blessing as she prepares to leave.
Yeah, it's a really touching scene. You can see in Naomi's genuine concern for these women, her daughters-in-law. She wants what's best for them. And she understands that as widows in a foreign land, their future would be very difficult.
But Ruth's response to Naomi's suggestion is incredible. In verses 16 and 17, she utters those powerful words that have resonated through the centuries. She says, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me."
That's powerful.
Talk about commitment.
Oh, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Orpah, she initially decides to go with Naomi. She's torn, but ultimately she chooses to return to her people. But Ruth, her commitment is unwavering. It's a beautiful picture of selfless devotion.
Yeah, she's leaving her home, her family, her culture, everything she's ever known, to follow Naomi into an uncertain future.
Absolutely. And it's not just a physical journey. She's embracing Naomi's people and even Naomi's God. It's a huge decision, a spiritual commitment as well.
So in verses 19 through 22, they arrive in Bethlehem, and their return causes a stir. The women of the town recognize Naomi, and they're like, "Is this Naomi?" But she's changed.
Oh, yeah. She's been through a lot.
She's been through a lot. She's bitter. And she tells them, "Call me not Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me.
Which, by the way, Mara means bitter.
Right.
Her name, Naomi, meant pleasant.
Right.
So she's basically saying, I'm not pleasant anymore, I'm bitter, I'm empty, I've lost everything.
Yeah, it's really sad. The chapter ends with them arriving at the beginning of the barley harvest, which, as we'll see, is a significant detail.
Absolutely. It's the beginning of a new season, a new chapter in their lives.
So, chapter 2. This is where we meet Boaz.
Ah, Boaz, a key character in this story.
He's described as a mighty man of wealth, and importantly, he's a kinsman of Naomi's late husband, Elimelech.
A kinsman, meaning he's a relative.
Right. And Ruth, ever resourceful, decides to go and glean in the fields to provide for herself and Naomi. Gleaning, for those who don't know, was basically like you could go into the fields after the harvest and pick up whatever grain was left behind. It was a way for the poor to survive.
Right. And it was actually a law in the Old Testament. It was a provision for the poor and the vulnerable.
Yeah.
You know, the widows, the orphans, the foreigners.
And as fate would have it, she ends up in the field of Boaz.
Yeah, it seems like a coincidence, but there are no coincidences in this story. I think God's providence is at work here.
And Boaz notices her, and he asks his foreman, whose damsel is this?
And when he finds out who she is, he's impressed by her loyalty to Naomi.
Yeah, he's really taken by her character. And he's incredibly kind to her. He tells her to stay in his fields, to glean close to his female servants so that she's safe. He even tells her to drink from the water that his men have drawn.
He goes above and beyond what's expected. And it's interesting, he even instructs his men to let her glean among the sheaves and to purposely drop some handfuls for her.
Wow.
You know, he's making sure she has more than enough. It's an act of generosity and kindness.
Yeah. It really is. And as a result, Ruth has an incredibly productive day. She gathers a huge amount of barley, about an ephah, which I guess is a significant amount.
It is, yeah, like half a bushel.
Wow. So she returns to Naomi and she's like, look at all this barley. And she tells her that she gleaned in the field of a man named Boaz.
And this is where Naomi gets excited. You know, she remembers Boaz, she knows he's a kinsman, and she sees the potential here.
Yeah, she's like, this could be good. She even blesses Boaz, saying, blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead.
So at this point, Naomi starts to formulate a plan.
Yeah.
She sees Boaz as a potential redeemer for Ruth.
Right. And that brings us to chapter 3, which is where things get a little bit more, well, interesting.
A little more dramatic.
Yes. Naomi instructs Ruth to go down to the threshing floor at night.
Now, the threshing floor was basically this open area where they separated the grain from the chaff. And it was often done at night because the wind was better for winnowing.
Right. So Naomi tells Ruth to, like, dress up, put on perfume, basically get ready.
Yeah. And she gives her some pretty specific instructions. She says, wait until Boaz is asleep, then uncover his feet and lie down at his feet.
Which, you know, in that culture was a pretty bold move.
Oh, yeah, it was. It was a way of appealing to him for protection and possibly, you know, hinting at marriage. It was definitely risky.
So Ruth does exactly what Naomi tells her. She goes down to the threshing floor, waits until Boaz is asleep, and then uncovers his feet and lies down at his feet.
And then Boaz wakes up. And he's like, who's there? And Ruth tells him who she is, and she makes a very direct request.
Yeah, she says, spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman.
Which in those days was a way of asking him to marry her, to take her as his wife.
And Boaz, he's not angry. He's actually honored. He says to her, blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. He sees her loyalty, her integrity, and he's willing to do the right thing.
But he also tells her that there's actually another kinsman who's closer related to Elimelech. And according to the law, that kinsman has the first right of redemption.
Right. So he tells her to wait until morning, and he'll take care of it.
And he sends her back to Naomi with a bunch of barley as a sign of his good intentions.
Okay, so now we're in chapter 4, and the tension's building.
Yeah, what's Boaz going to do?
Right. So Boaz goes to the city gate.
Which was like the town square, right?
Yeah, like the place where everything happened. Legal matters, business deals, you name it. And he finds the other kinsman, and he calls 10 elders to witness.
Right. He wants to make sure everything's done properly, according to the law.
So he lays out the situation. He tells the other kinsman, Naomi is selling the land that belonged to Elimelech, and you, as the nearest kinsman, have the right to buy it.
And initially, the guy's like, yeah, sure, I'll buy it. He's interested in the land.
But then Boaz adds, oh, by the way, if you buy the land, you also have to marry Ruth.
And that's where things change.
Yeah.
The guy starts thinking, wait a minute, if I marry Ruth and we have a son, that son will be the heir of Elimelech's land.
Right. And that could mess up my own inheritance.
Exactly. So he backs out. He says, I can't redeem it for myself.
And to make it official, he takes off his sandal and gives it to Boaz.
Which was a custom in those days, a symbol of transferring the right of redemption.
And Boaz is like, all right, I'll do it. He buys the land and he marries Ruth.
And the elders are all like, good job, Boaz. This is awesome. They bless them and they say, may your house be like the house of Pharez, whom Tamar bore to Judah.
And then in a beautiful twist, the Lord blesses Ruth and she conceives and gives birth to a son.
A son, which is a huge deal, right? Because it means that Elimelech's line will continue.
And they name the son Obed. And the women of Bethlehem, they're so happy for Naomi. They're like, now you have a grandson to care for you in your old age.
It's a beautiful picture of restoration. Naomi, who started out feeling so empty and bitter, is now filled with joy.
And the book concludes with a genealogy, tracing the lineage from Pharez all the way down to David.
Which is really significant because it shows that Ruth, this Moabite woman, is in the direct line of King David. And, of course, ultimately in the line of Jesus.
Wow.
It's like from emptiness to fullness, from bitterness to redemption. It's an incredible story.
It really is.
So what do you think? What are some of the key takeaways from the Book of Ruth for us today?
Well, I think it's a story about loyalty, about faithfulness, about doing the right thing, even when it's hard.
Absolutely. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi is inspiring. And Boaz, he's a great example of a man of integrity and compassion.
Yeah. And it's also a story about God's providence. Even in the midst of tragedy and hardship, God is working behind the scenes to bring about his purposes.
And ultimately, it's a story about redemption, about how God can take something broken and make it beautiful.
It's a reminder that no matter where we come from, no matter what our past looks like, God can use us for his glory.
Yeah, that's right. He can redeem our stories, and he can use us to bless others.
So as you reflect on the Book of Ruth, think about the ways that you might be called to show loyalty, kindness, and compassion to those around you.
And remember that even in the midst of difficulty, God is at work, and he can use your story for good.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Book of Ruth.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.